Sonic SE3 now has a brand new wavetable synthesizer library called FLUX. So let me take you through the basics of that new FLUX library by coming over here to Instruments and choosing Sonic SE right here, and then using that new feature of clicking and dragging over into the project. I'm going to add that to this project. And for simplicity's sake, I pre-recorded a MIDI loop right here, and I'm just going to click and drag that onto the Sonic SE track. And that way we'll be able to listen to some of the presets. So when we come over to Sonic SE, it's currently blank. In other words, there are no instruments installed, but we need to make sure that we're looking at the FLUX library. So I'm going to come to the Load tab, click on the Library button here. Here's all the libraries that come with Sonic SE, and now there's this new one called FLUX. So I'll click on that, and then I could use the browser, and I recommend that you go through and listen to these sounds because they're really cool, and probably something that you haven't heard before because there's a lot of people who haven't used wavetable synthesizers before. But I'm going to scroll up here and go through a couple of my favorites. I really like this deep meditation patch. Let's listen to this. Or Dazzling Chroma. Or Dawn Destruction. Digital Flame. Now that has an arpeggiator on it because FLUX has its own arpeggiator as well. But for now, let me show you a little bit more about wavetable synthesizers and how you can get to some of those really cool and unique sounds. I'm going to call up a patch called Tornado, so I'll scroll down here and double click on that. And then let's go into the Edit tab, and to show you how a wavetable synthesizer works, I'm going to make this as basic as possible by turning off the second of two oscillators. So now we have just one oscillator here and the other oscillator is disabled. And then I'm also going to turn off the filter. So this will give us just a really basic sound for the different wavetables that we're selecting. So a wavetable is actually a long list or table of waveforms. And there's a couple of different ways to manipulate them. Under the drop-down menu right here, you can choose different wavetables. So let's just listen to the sine sweep right now, and it gives you a visual representation of that sine wave. So I'll press play on that MIDI loop. Now with all the effects and everything turned off, it sounds very FM, and it should because it's a sine wave, and that's what FM synthesizers use to create complex waveforms. But then we have the option of using a formant variation or a multi-oscillator. Now with the formant off right now, if I change the position of where that waveform or where the oscillator's playing back on that wavetable, then we'll be able to listen to different parts of the wavetable. See how the waveform is changing too? So essentially, the higher the position, usually the more complex the wavetable gets. So I'll go ahead and drag that down to the original position. And then let's check out the formant option, because this is going to give you kind of the mouth control of a human mouth. And then that activates the formant control. And actually, I'm going to increase the position here a little bit so we get a little bit more complex waveform. Now let's listen to the different formants. Let's try some different oscillators themselves. So we can come into the additive option here and choose additive 1. Additive 2. Let's try some of the complex options. Here's aggressive growl. Just ignore the fact that it's misspelled. Now that's a really interesting waveform. Let's try the saw formant. And now you can really hear that formant option being applied to that waveform. Let's turn that off and let me tell you a little bit about the multi option. I'm going to make that waveform a little bit more simple. If I have the multi option turned on, that's very similar to the unison effect on an analog synthesizer, in that instead of getting one waveform playing with one note, you're going to get multiple waveforms playing at the same time, and you can vary the number of notes that are being used. And to access that multi option, click on the multi tab here, and now you can choose that number of voices. And when I increase that value, look at what happens to the waveform. It gets thicker, but just like with an analog synthesizer, if you detune the voices, it gets big and fat. Then let me quickly take you through the rest of the options on the synthesizer. You do have 2 oscillators, so you could turn on the other oscillator and get even more dense layers. And there's a filter option here with multiple different filter types. If you just click on that filter drop-down menu right there on that little chevron, you can choose those different filters. Plus you have a filter and amplifier envelope and an additional auxiliary envelope, envelope 3, for assigning to other parameters inside of the synthesizer. Then there's also the LFO or low frequency oscillator page. And then at the top of the FLUX interface, you'll find the sub-oscillator so that you can add a third oscillator. You can even add the noise option if you turn on the noise oscillator right here. So you can be using both the sub-oscillator and the noise generator together with 2 different oscillators. On the mod page, you have 16 sources and 16 destinations. On the voice tab, you have the options of how much polyphony you want a sound to use, or whether it's mono or polyphonic, and what trigger mode you're using if it is in mono mode, and the pitch bend up and down values. Then on the arpeggiator, you can turn that on with that little button. There's a whole bunch of factory presets, but you can also program your own by clicking the user tab right here. And if I play the MIDI loop, you'll see how the arpeggiator works. So in this option here, you can see what step is being played on the arpeggiator, and you can change the velocity by clicking and dragging on the velocities here. You can also change the transposition of the notes themselves. If I wanted to make that an octave lower, I could just type in -12. So if you're looking for some really unique synthesis options, make sure you check out that FLUX library. And next, let's talk about direct offline processing.